Hello, I'm JJ Rockwell. I've gotten a haircut since this interview aired, and I'm interviewing my father's good friend John Strednansky, who works largely in the rock world, especially in the Bay Area. He has his roots in KSPB, which is our radio station here, and I can't wait for you to hear what he has to say. All right, so just tell me a little bit about like KSPB back in the 80s.
Tell you about what? I'm sorry.
KSPB.
I have to turn the volume.
Like the KSPB radio station.
Oh, tell you about it?
Yeah, like back in the day.
Oh my God, yeah. So that was kind of my first open door into the supporting the music industry, and I had a friend. His name was Brian Ford, and he went to RLS, and he was doing a Monday night heavy metal show. And back in the early 80s, Metal Mondays were like the in thing. Heavy metal was always done on a Monday for some reason. So he invited me to come join him as a co-host. And I did that for about 2 years. And we did, we played a lot of the early 80s new wave or British heavy metal stuff. It was a really good dynamic because I was more into the European heavier stuff, and Brian Ford was more into the more melodic, the Journey, the Foreigner, the kind of the US kind of hard rock stuff of that era. And yeah, we did that for about 2 years. And it was, when I sent you the flyer, that's when I was in the middle of doing this show. So Lars and I had been friends for even before he started the band. So he asked me to put together a quote, and he quoted me and put it on a poster that they used all over LA back then in the day. So yeah, a lot of fun. And it kind of opened the door to other things. And the next step was then starting the magazine, Metal Rendezvous, that I started down in Monterey, right after that.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit more about Metal Rendezvous.
So we were hanging around with a really good friend of ours. His name's Bob Gamber. He owns Vinyl Revolution, a great record store in Pacific Grove. He's also in the movie that I'm sure we'll talk about later, in the documentary. Mm-hmm. But he introduced me to so many bands from the early 70s and late 60s, the hard rock bands that really got everything started. And we were just sitting around, and he was telling me, man, a friend of mine in Tampa, he just started a magazine, and just out of the blue, just does a magazine about music, about hard rock and heavy metal music. And we thought about it, and we thought, well, is that something we might want to do, because we're totally into it, and it would expose us to new bands. And another friend of ours, his name was Tim, he suddenly showed up at one of our beer nights and showed us the first issue of Metal Rendezvous. I wasn't even involved. He just put it together with Brian Ford from KSPB. And it was just really cheap, really copied on a Xerox machine, stapled in one corner, and it featured just a couple local bands and some random album reviews. But I thought, man, this is really cool. This is something that we should get involved in. And we kind of took it over. We, meaning me and Bill Hale, one of my best friends and high school friends, that started taking all the pictures for the magazine. And then we did issue number 2, and it just grew from there. We were publishing from 1983 through 1989. At the very end, we were doing 125,000 copies of the magazine. Published in full color with international distribution. And I mean, it grew from a fanzine, because back then it was really the fanzine days, all the way to a full-blown magazine at the end of its run in the late 80s.
That's so cool. What do you think made Metal Rendezvous really successful?
For one, is that we quickly decided to run it as a business. And meaning is that we hired somebody. We got another person to run the business end. Bill and I were huge fans. We did not want to let that go by side. We don't want it to go to waste. We really wanted to, as far as the content, we really wanted that to come through, that we're fans. We're doing this not for fame or fortune. We're doing this because we love the music. And yet we had the business side handled by our partner, Ed. He took care of the distribution, the advertising, arranging for the right printers, all of that stuff, right? So it was a really good combination of common business sense and business intelligence and the spirit of what the fanzine was all about. It was a magazine made by fans for fans. And we also featured a pretty broad range of music. A lot of our, I don't want to call them competitors, a lot of our friends that were also publishing fanzines really tended to focus on one certain style, either thrash metal or punk metal or hair metal or whatever. But we really broadened it and made it a little more commercially acceptable. We featured everything from the bands that were big on MTV to obscure bands from Southern Europe. We had a really good mix of that style, and I think all that added up to us getting the success that we did get.
So what are some of your favorite like metal scene events that you've had, like that you were a part of, either just in general or maybe a door that Metal Rendezvous opened for you?
Well, I mean, meeting everybody, you name them in the 80s, and I got to meet them and got to know them. With some of them, I'm still friends. Just earlier today, I got an email from Mike Tram from White Line. We're still in touch. It's those kind of connections that became possible. Of course, in the early days, starting to do the early interviews was phenomenal because I was still a fan. I was still a kid, and suddenly I got to interview Glenn Hughes, who was a bass player in Deep Purple. It was just awesome. It was one of my earliest interviews. Or YNT, Dave Meniketti, those kind of people. So that was the exciting part. Once Metal Rendezvous became established, getting interviews was not a big deal. Instead of us asking, it became the record companies and the management companies asking us to do interviews and the stories. And we were invited and flown all over the US to parties, record release parties, concerts. We didn't pay for, I went to see, and the other day I tried to compile a list, over 1,000 shows in the 80s, concerts. We didn't have to pay for any of them. We had backstage passes to all of them and the parties. Sure, some stood out. The big day on the green in 1985 in San Francisco with, there was Scorpions, Metallica, YNT, Yngwie Malmsteen, Victory, and I think, and Rat, I think, was there too. Yeah, I mean, that was one concert, day on the green. And we had, all access passes and met up with the Scorpions the night before at the hotel and hung out at a dinner and interviewed them. So those are the kind of things that really made it special, especially coming from the fan side, not the business side. To me, that was the most awesome thing. Yeah.
Wow. And so now I've heard that you had a pretty impressive album and like CD collection. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how that came into play?
Well, I started collecting albums back in the 70s. When we first moved to America from Europe, I got a job at a gas station, and it was up in Marin County, San Rafael, before I moved to Monterey 6 months later. But I got paid under the table, $2 an hour, which was actually quite good money back then. $2 an hour, but he made me work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, during the summer, right? You do the math, $120 a week. That wasn't bad. That was really good money back in the 70s. I spent it all on records, and on my day off, which was a Tuesday, I took the bus into San Francisco and just went through all the record stores I could find and just started buying up albums. Even if I didn't know a band, but the cover looked good or the album title was cool or the song titles were great, I bought it. And so I discovered a lot of bands that I wouldn't otherwise. And I also grew to be a big fan of the whole music scene. So, and that continued. And of course, once the magazine got up and going, I was receiving albums every day in the mail, everything from demo tapes from new bands to records from the record companies to advanced releases, and eventually, of course, CDs became the norm. And that continued because even when Metal Rendezvous ended, I continued to do some freelance writing for some other publications that still existed. So that continued. It still continues till today. I still get stuff today because I still continue to interview bands and promote and kind of stay a little bit of active in the scene. Yeah, so it grew. At one point, I think I had about 8,000, 9,000 CDs, physical CDs. Now I switched over to, I'm trying to be modern and be, MP3s and have everything on a hard drive.
So now I just watched the documentary a little while ago now, but I found it really interesting to see like all those rockers like just talking about what they love. What was one of your favorite parts about making Godfathers?
Uh, and again, it's the people connection. I mentioned earlier that just getting to know them. Back in the 80s, I got to know them as stars, right? As music stars, and people that I kind of at times worshipped. Then I got to know them as people. And now doing the documentary, I got to revisit some of those friendships that I made back in the 80s. A lot of them I lost contact with. So it took some work to locate some of them. But pretty much everybody we wanted to locate, we did, which was awesome. And everybody was just so excited about doing this. So I flew out a number of times to the Bay Area. I live in Dallas now, and we just spent several days tracking people down, just going up and down the Bay Area and doing these interviews. We also went to NAMM and tracked down a bunch of people down there, of course, when they have the annual music convention in Los Angeles. We did some of the interviews down there as well. So to me, that was the biggest piece in terms of revisiting these friendships. And of course, the nostalgia kicked in when we talked about the good old days and the fun and the parties and the great music that we all experienced and the friendships that were built. That was the other part that really was fun to do about the movie.
So do you want to tell me a little bit more about how you made the movie? What was your vision for it, and how did it kind of come to fruition?
Yeah. So the vision, I got to give credit to my partner, Bob Nalbadian, who directed it. Bob actually did several other movies of this type down in Los Angeles. You know, the Inside Metal is actually a series of movies, right? So there is a Inside Metal, the early LA scene. Then there's Inside Metal about the LA thrash scene, and Inside Metal. There was a third one. I don't remember what it's called. But then he approached me and said, "Hey, I want to do one up in the Bay Area, and you seem to be the ideal person that can help me with this." Bob was one of my writers back in the Metal Rendezvous days too, that we ran. So we've known each other for 40 years. And I said, "Oh, well, of course, I'll do that." And we started kind of putting some names on paper. Well, who do we want to talk to? What do we want to talk about? And once we had the list of names and bands, I went through my files and found pictures and demo tapes and music. We reached out to other people in the Bay Area because we wanted to really make this movie not just about the Bay Area, but make it with the people that were part of that scene, right? So everybody involved was part of that scene back then. And there were Bay Area people. We didn't bring in a Hollywood producer. You can tell it's relatively low budget, but it really brought out the grit and the truth that was all about. So we brought in Dennis Shipman, who runs reality TV up in San Francisco. We brought in Ron Quintana, who has one of the most famous San Francisco-based fanzine, Metal Mania. He had that back in the 80s. We brought him in. And of course, Bill Hale, my partner and photographer from the Metal Rendezvous days, supplied a lot of the photos that you see in the movie as well. So that was our vision. Really just get it done by the people that made it happen back then. Now are going to make the movie now. And we traveled around, did the interviews. We had a professional cameraman, but that person wasn't always available. So believe it or not, some of those interviews were done on an iPhone. If you look at my favorite one was with Bob Gamber at Vinyl Revolution in Pacific Grove. That was done with my iPhone. That interview. It turned out great. It's awesome. But again, we really wanted to talk about just what it was. We didn't want to make it pretty or ugly. We just wanted to tell the truth. We didn't want to give it the Hollywood polish. We just wanted it to be genuine, and I think it worked out pretty well that way.
I definitely think that came through from watching it. So
cool.
How I noticed a lot of the rockers were wearing like different, like they were wearing shirts from the bands that like they weren't in, but they were kind of like fans of. Was that something that you planned, or did you just kind of like show up when they just had their rock shirts on?
We didn't give anybody any direction. Again, going back to my earlier statement, this needed to be genuine. That stuff, you saw the Exodus guys with Exodus shirts or whatever. That's what they wore. That's what they wear every day, right? Some of them have become more professional and moved on to careers of some sort, like myself, right? But Some of them are still playing. You know, we had Vicious Rumors, for example, in the documentary. They're still cranking it out, you know, continuously and doing albums. Obviously, Metallica. I know Lars Ulrich was in the movie. They're doing as good as one would expect. So, no, we didn't have any kind of direction. Just show up the way you want to show up, the way you want to be known and seen, and we'll film you that way. Yeah. No makeup. We didn't have a makeup artist. You know, again, just trying to be genuine. Yeah.
That's great. So now, if you had to make it again, is there anything you would have done differently?
No, not at all. We had so much material. You know, believe it or not, there's a part 2 coming out in about 2 months. Which because we must have had 100 hours of material, right, that we chose from. Would we want to do it differently? You know, there's always names that you think of afterwards. Oh, darn, that was this one band that we just didn't think of when we put that list together, right? I wish we would have gotten hold of the guitar player from that band. So there are a few bands that maybe we could have and should have included that we didn't. If you want to call it doing it differently, I don't know. Maybe it's just maybe we should have been a little more aggressive and a little more thoughtful about who all needed to be in the movie. But I think we got a good cross section of everybody that needed to be there, and we got it done.
So now, I know you mentioned that you have another part 2 coming out, but anything else new on the horizon for you in the rock world?
For me, I continue to do interviews with bands just for fun. Bob Nalbanian, the director of Inside Metal, the Bay Area Godfathers, he has a podcast going on, and I contribute sometimes material to it. It's kind of a 2-sided podcast. On one side, he invites people from the industry and we discuss things. It's kind of like a roundtable discussion around a topic. And 2, then he features interviews from artists from all over the world. So I did a band called Crystal Viper. I think I sent you a link to that. Just interviewed them a couple of weeks ago. Those kind of things. Bob, I know he's interested in doing the next Inside Metal, and he's thinking about, you know, New York and then Europe. For me, the New York thing, I think I'll leave others to do it. I think there's some people that I know and he knows in New York that would be better suited for that. But when he does the European one, I think I want to be involved in that, because me coming from Europe, and Metal Rendezvous was very European focused as well. We featured a lot of acts from Europe. I think it'll be a good fit for us to do that. Timing on that with COVID and everything else going on, kind of up in the air right now, but it's something that we're thinking about. Yeah.
So, having started so young, you've made like decades-long relationships. What are some of your favorite relationships you've made along the way? And if you have a couple stories you want to share on the air, I'd love to hear them.
Some of the what relationships? You broke up there for a second.
Oh, sorry. Just like some of your favorite relationships that you've made along the way in this rock journey.
Again, some of them were really good. I mean, you know, like I said, I've known Lars since we both worked at gas stations, you know, and even though I'm not that much in touch with him nowadays, it's still an important part of how I evolved back in the 80s, because we were always in touch back then. Bob himself has been tremendous. You know, my friendship has lasted since we first met back in 1982, I believe, or so, when we first started this. And it was that friendship that allowed me then to help him with the documentary of the Bay Area Godfathers. And there's other musicians that I'm still talking to all the time. I mentioned Mike Tramp. I mentioned the guys from Las Rocket I'm still in touch with, the Ruffians, a lot of the bands that we talk about. Damage, the band that from San Jose, I actually produced their album when it was recorded back in 1984, still in touch with them. It's, you know, as you grow older, the personal relationships become more important than the other stuff and other fluff around it. And that's what has remained important to me, is to be in touch. And when I'm in San Francisco, I can pick up the phone and say, hey, let's go grab a drink, or let's go have dinner. And there's always somebody around that's willing, and we chat, talk about the good times and see what else is going on. Yeah.
That's great. If there's any other stories or anything you want to tell, we can just leave it open. That's all I have for questions.
Well, no, You asked earlier some of the events that Metal Rendezvous opened the doors to. Some of the crazy things that we were part of were when we got invited to some of these record release parties, right? That's when record companies throw on this big bash, his new album coming out. That's they don't do that anymore, right? Unless it's, U2 or somebody like that nowadays. But back then, a new album came out and there was a big party. I remember the one that Iron Maiden had for Seventh Son of the Seventh Son. They flew us to LA and then they flew us to New York, and we attended both of those parties. And the one in LA was awesome. It was at some recording studio. I don't remember where, but everybody was somebody in '88 was there. From Lita Ford to Guns N' Roses to, you name them, right? So, and food was great, drinks were open bar, food, all of that kind of stuff. They played the album. And then after that, we went to a bar in Hollywood, and it was me and the girl I was dating at the time. It was Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses. It was Jim from Faith No More, and couple other people, and we just went to the bar and hung out all night. And it was hilarious because that's when just Appetite for Destruction came out, and they were not as big yet, but MTV was playing up in it was the Cat and the Fiddle, a restaurant and bar up in the MTV was playing, and Welcome to the Jungle came on, and Axl jumped on the table and started singing along to MTV, while we were drinking. So it's those kind of things that are memorable, that are awesome. There were quite a few of those kind of events that we had. And then 3 days later, we were in New York trying to duplicate that. I didn't know as many people there as I did in LA, but it was kind of similar thing, right? And just all the people that I got to meet throughout the time was just awesome. And then at the end of the Metal Rendezvous, there was something called Foundations Forum. I don't know if you heard about that. It was a heavy metal convention. Every year they had it, and it was put on by Concrete Management, which was based out of New York. And the Foundations Forum was just a 4-day event that brought heavy metal industry, just into LA. And there were panels, discussions, and showcases by bands. And it was always in a hotel. And it always got so crazy because the hotel never allowed us to come back the next year. We had to find a new hotel every year. But the coolest thing is that some of these musicians did like private little showcases in a hotel rooms, so you could find, CC DeVille, doing a little guitar intro or a guitar session in his hotel room that you could just go and kind of hang out with them. And then at night in the conference rooms, they had bands playing. And like Kiss, Scorpions, Judas Priest, all of them played at this heavy metal convention. And they were you just hanging. So it wasn't like you had a backstage pass. You were just part of it. My fun story there at one of these conventions was that a really good friend of mine who was a publicist who actually arranged that Scorpions dinner in '85 that I mentioned earlier. She was doing publicity for Peter Criss, the original Kiss drummer. And he was hurting at the time. This was 1991 maybe. He was really hurting. He had a new album coming out, but by then, Kiss moved on with different drummers and all that. And so Laura, she called me and said, "Hey, can you do an interview with Peter Criss? I'm having a hard time getting him press, and I know you're writing for other publications. That's when I was being a freelancer. Can you do something?" And I said, "Of course, I would love to interview Peter Criss. I am at Foundations Forum. Where can we meet up?" And she said, "Oh, he'll come to you, right?" And I said, "Well, does he have a badge? Because you need a badge just to even get into the hotel." And she said, No, can we do something?" I said, "Don't worry." So I took one of the other of my friends' badge. I went down to the parking lot, met up with Peter Criss, took him up to my room, right? Snuck him into the room, and we did the interview. But the interesting piece is that I told him, "Hey, Peter, did you know that Kiss is here in the hotel and they're playing here tonight, a showcase?" And he said, "No, I didn't know this." Right? And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh man, it would be kind of interesting to connect with, Gene and Paul again after all these years." And I said, "Hey, I'll tell you what, let me take you down to Concrete Management, the one putting it on, to their office downstairs and see if I can get you a pass and all that. And I did. And they, of course, they gave him a pass. And he and Gene and Paul met up. And a few months later, the KISS reunion with the original lineup was announced. So you wonder, it's just one of those things. Did I have anything to do with, with that? It's those kind of stories that are just the ones that stick out, from that era. A lot of good stuff.
So now I'm sure with all of these rock events, you've got some pretty cool memorabilia. Any favorites you want to share?
I've actually got to admit to you, I don't have much left. I've moved so many times, and it was just getting a little too expensive to move, too heavy. So I don't have much left. I'm kind of trying to I'm sitting in my own home office here and see what I got. There's a few things I have. I have like a little Warlock that Doro Pesh from Warlock sent me as a thank you. Once. I still have that. I got some kind of cool box sets that were kind of came out throughout the time that I decided to keep, and of course some records that I'm thanked on. I decided to keep some of that vinyl. But honestly, not much into that memorabilia. Even though most of the T-shirts that I used to have, I don't have anymore, unfortunately, because some of them are worth some good money right nowadays. But no.
Do you have an opinion? Like, I know a lot of my friends now, like in high school, they're starting to get like this sort of nostalgia for vinyls, even though they weren't like around for vinyls.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
I can't believe what they're charging for those things. You go down to Target and it's like $29. What? For what? I used to buy this stuff for $2.99, or at Recycled Records down on Lighthouse Avenue for $1. It's cool. I gotta say, if you have a good stereo, nothing beats the sound of vinyl. It is the best sound you can have. I know people said when CDs came out, that's the cleanest. There's no pops. There's none of that. But it's that. It's almost like a cliche, but that warm sound that you get from vinyl, you can't duplicate that with digital. So if they're doing it for the sound, and if they have the equipment for it, more power to them. Go get as much vinyl as you want, but you really got to appreciate it. You got to have the big speakers. You got to have all of that goes with it. If you're just doing it because it's cool, hey, if it makes them happy, who am I to criticize it, right? I'm kind of boring now. I just record companies kind of switched to not even keep sending you albums or CDs or tapes anymore. They just send you a link to download your MP3s, right, as a promo. So I've kind of transitioned to that, and it's kind of maybe it's a little boring, but it's kind of nice to have everything at your, in your iPhone and pick whatever song you want and play it. But yeah, the vinyl sound still, I'll be the first to say it is. If you're doing it for the sound, do it, because it is awesome.
All right, that's all for this week. That was John Strednansky. I'm JJ Rockwell. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.